listener production.
Hello, welcome to the Briefing's Best of Summer series. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt, and for the next couple of weeks, we are bringing you some of your favourite deep dives from the last 12 months. And of course, it's Christmas Eve. Maybe you're hanging out with the fam, maybe you're trying to avoid them. Great time to catch up on some of your absolute favourite episodes from 2024. And today we're talking about true crime. Have you heard the claim that there's a serial killer running rampant on the New South Wales North Coast?
It's an absolute stain on our society that we have not solved these cases, and some of them have been so poorly investigated.
The theory sent TikTok into a tailspin, but was also criticised for unfairly alarming people, especially women. In today's deep dive, we're talking with Jeremy Buckingham. He's the independent MP who made the very serious claims in Parliament 2 months ago. First, though, it's time for the headlines from the Listener newsroom. It is Tuesday, the 24th of December.
Good morning, I'm James Lake. Fire crews are busy building containment lines around 3 major blazes burning out of control across Victoria. They're bracing now for the return of extreme heat and gale force winds on Thursday, which will also create catastrophic fire conditions for the state. CFA Chief Jason Heffernan says it will be a very challenging day.
The fuel is very dry. The bush is dry. It is ready to burn.
Drivers hitting the roads this Christmas Eve are being reminded to stay calm behind the wheel if they find themselves stuck in holiday traffic. The NRMA's Peter Keary says the death toll's already higher than the same time last year, and it's important to take extra care on the road.
Stop every 2 hours, make sure the kids are in their seatbelts. And the obvious things around speeding and drink driving. Put your phone away. These are the basic steps that we know can help to get you to your holiday and back again.
Overseas now, Nissan and Honda are set to merge in a deal which could make them the world's third largest car manufacturer. The plan would put them on the heels of Toyota and Volkswagen, with a new company worth over $50 billion. Just weeks before Donald Trump returns to the White House, Joe Biden has commuted the death sentences of 37 out of 40 federal prisoners on death row. The decision spares the lives of individuals convicted of serious crimes, including the killings of police officers and military personnel. And Australia's most famous crocodile, Bert, has passed away at the ripe old age of 90. The 5-metre salty had a starring role in Crocodile Dundee and spent the last decades of his life living in an aquarium in Darwin.
Thanks to the Listener newsroom for those headlines. Next up is my chat with independent MP Jeremy Buckingham from November, where we discussed his claims that there is a serial killer running rampant in Byron Bay. Just a heads up before we get into this deep dive, we are talking about some pretty serious issues, including sexual assault and murder. If that's not for you, fair enough. We'll see you next time.
The worst serial killer in the nation's history has gotten away with it. Ivan Milat was convicted of 7 murders. There is someone on the North Coast that has murdered as many or more, and they are still amongst us if they haven't died or fled the country. The worst crime in our state's history is unresolved.
Is it possible that there's a serial killer wreaking havoc in Byron Bay? That's the question being raised by Jeremy Buckingham, Legalise Cannabis Party MP and member of the New South Wales Legislative Council. In an impassioned address to Parliament, he's made the case for the state to take a serious look at 67 missing or murdered women along the New South Wales North Coast between 1977 and 2009. But is this call out alarmist? Is raising the question a sign that government and police are taking violence against women more seriously? Or do these accusations risk opening old wounds for the hundreds of friends and family members linked to each horrible disappearance and death? Jeremy Buckingham, welcome to the briefing. Tell me why you think these 67 deaths and missing persons cases could all be linked.
Well, what I think is that there's remarkable similarities between the type of victim and the modus operandi in a lot of these cases. Now, I don't think all of them are linked. I'm not suggesting that. I think that it's highly likely that we've got a number of individual crimes and perpetrators and victims that aren't linked. But if you look at just the total number, which is a staggering number, and the type of victim, the type of person that was subject to these crimes, and the modus operandi of the perpetrators, there's remarkable similarities, and you really don't see anywhere else in Australia this cluster of these types of crimes in such a small population. You look at the north coast of Queensland, south coast of New South Wales or Tasmania, similar demographics, similar population size. You just don't have these numbers of the same type of victim and crime. So I think it's highly likely that some are linked and therefore a serial killer.
There has been some criticism since you raised this that you're being alarmist by saying it's the possible work of potentially multiple serial killers. What's your response to that?
Well, I think what's alarming is that these crimes are unsolved and that there are remarkable similarities with many of them. I think that's the alarming thing, that even if these are all individual cases, it's an absolute stain on our society that we have not solved these cases, and some of them have been so poorly investigated. So if that's what people would prefer to operate under, sure, but I believe when you look at the cases, there are remarkable similarities. Women abducted from local roads, at the bus stop, walking home, and then they turn up sometimes years later, a body discovered in a remote area where you need local knowledge, and a similar type of crime. It's very rare to have that crime. It's incredibly rare to have that crime go unsolved. And so to have dozens and dozens of cases of it is utterly appalling. And criminologists are telling me it's highly likely that you have we've established there's causal links between these things, and criminologists are saying it's highly likely that this is a repeat offender for at least a significant number of them. Ivan Milat, he was convicted of 7 murders. I think it's likely, a reasonable person would see it as likely that many of these cases are linked, and therefore someone who's committing a crime on the scale of Ivan Milat has gotten away with it.
The interesting thing I've noticed since you've brought this up is the response of women, because I think, I speak myself as a woman who has felt that fear of walking alone at night or catching public transport by myself, and it has struck a chord with the community, especially women on the mid-north coast and the north coast of New South Wales. Multiple women have taken to TikTok and other social media sites to share their own experiences in the region and kind of share their own theories. It's clearly gotten a lot of people talking.
There are men going missing. There is a possible serial rapist that targets foreign women that aren't going to stick around and press charges.
With the situation that happened with me, the man just felt so experienced in what he was doing.
I have had friends that have been raped in Byron. I've had friends that have had their drinks spiked in Byron.
I don't know if it's multiple serial killers or if it's like a large organised group. But the way that my report was handled and the way that a lot of people in Byron felt about it or talked about it made me feel like there's a lot of people that know a lot more than they are letting on.
Do you feel this reflects that women in the community feel that their safety just isn't a priority for police and for lawmakers?
That is exactly what people are saying, and that the attitudes of police are improving, and the resourcing they're putting into domestic violence and these types of crimes is a lot better than it was in the 70s, 80s and 90s. But we still have to hold the police to account for their failures in these areas. In an age when we're trying to stamp out violence in the community generally and really stamp out violence in terms of domestic violence and violence against women, we need to make sure that our police resources are going into the crimes that really matter, and that shouldn't be based on your postcode. Imagine if this number of crimes were unsolved and this type of most heinous crime had occurred in the eastern suburbs of Sydney or the northern beaches of Sydney or in inner Melbourne. There would be hundreds of police kicking down doors, taking names, and shaking the truth out of these perpetrators. Well, that hasn't happened on the North Coast, and everywhere I went, everywhere I looked on the North Coast, there were another group, a community group, a family, an article in the newspaper where people were saying, what happened in our town? What happened to these 3 or 4 women? In the Clarence Valley, it's 12 around Grafton. Kempsey, another 3 or 4. Bellingen, my town, 3. Coffs, 3. And everywhere you looked, there was another community group saying, what happened to justice for my daughter, my sister, my mother? And they continue to make those calls. And until the government resources these investigations, then we've got a big problem. And that's what I met with the Premier last week and senior police and the police minister, and no one is prepared to stand up and say it's not true. No one's prepared to say this is what actually happened. And we've seen also that the police actually did have some task forces that were looking at these collectively. Well, I think they should redo those task forces again and redouble their efforts.
I'm wondering if what you're referring to and what your answer just before when you're talking about, I suppose, the lack of serious interest by police in these cases in this region, in the mid-North Coast and North Coast. Are you suggesting that potentially it's not just because there's a lack of concern about the women, but also women from a particular socioeconomic background or a particular racial background?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So many of these women were black, hippies, poor. They came from working class backgrounds. There was a class and a racial element to the types of women that disappeared, and that's one of the key things, that if this had happened in the eastern suburbs of a major city, then I think we would have had a much better outcome. And lots of these women were First Nations. Lots of them were, lived alternative or lifestyles, that sort of thing. They were out hitchhiking, they were catching the bus, they were walking home, they were coming home late, they'd been out partying or whatever. But that's their right. Good luck to them. They didn't deserve to die, and they needed the resources of the police absolutely thrown at this. And in many instances, families of murdered and missing women, they weren't interviewed for weeks or months after their loved one disappeared. In some cases, coronial inquests, there have been reviews of the evidence that have been gathered by the police. And in one case of Susan Kiley, her family was shocked to learn that there were no written records of her disappearance or any action the police had taken. So imagine that was your sister, your mum, who disappeared, and the police were saying, well, the file's empty. We can't find a record of anything we did to try and find your murdered loved one. That is absolutely appalling, and it cannot stand. And I'll keep raising the issue in the Parliament until the resources are put in place. We look at all these crimes again, some of them collectively, and redouble our efforts, because the victims and their families and the communities demand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can hear the passion in your voice, and I agree with you that it feels like a real disservice to these women. Let's talk solutions then. So you've said that there have been a number of task forces that have failed to kind of turn up any real true leads or solve any of these cases. What do you want to see happen aside from those being restarted and investigations kicked back off?
What I want to do is make sure that's on the agenda for the Premier. I want to make sure that we use the resources of the Parliament to, I've already passed a motion through the New South Wales Parliament to have all the documents relating to these inquiries brought back into the public view. I'll be looking at those. I'm taking a criminologist, a senior criminologist who I've been working on this case with, to meet with the Premier and prevent evidence and build our case that there needs to be resourcing of the police, a specialist strike force looking at this, resourcing of the unsolved homicide unit to make sure they've got the resources to investigate this. One of the suggestions has been that we reach out to retired and former police, both who are interested in the case, in these cases, involved in the cases, or who are, as I say, retired. They do that in the United States to get them involved in re-looking at the evidence, or in some instances, looking at the evidence collectively for the first time. So in so many cases, they didn't apply the best techniques in terms of DNA and comparing evidence. So I think we should build a database of these crimes, which I'm sure they already have, but start doing the cross-referencing and cross-checking of what happened where, who was where, what happened, and apply, all hands to the press to make sure that we get a result in at least some of these cases.
Jeremy Buckingham, it's been a really interesting chat. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please do keep us updated on your progress on this, because I think it's worth following.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention. It's what will hopefully bring a better outcome for in some of these cases. I really appreciate you focusing on it, because it's a critical issue, delivering justice for these communities and these families.
That was my chat with Independent MP Jeremy Buckingham from November there. And that is it for this episode of the Briefing's Best of Summer series. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, if you could share this deep dive with someone you think might enjoy it, we would absolutely love that. And don't forget to keep up with our other content on Instagram, TikTok and YouTube. And it is Christmas tomorrow, but we will be back in your feed with another Best of Ep at 6 a.m. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you then.
Listener.